Okay, so this short video is just to finish up on the diffraction grading that we're starting to talk about in class. So a diffraction grading is basically a situation where we're looking at multiple slit interference, but the exception, as I mentioned in class, is that we can get these interference patterns from white light, or it doesn't have to actually be a monochromatic light source. And it's basically a way that we can look at spectra of light, which is looking at the component wavelengths that make up a particular light source. So the way that we usually would make a diffraction grating is you actually make grooves on like glass. So it's actually not really slits, but the grooves act as slits, and so it's the same thing practically. Now what we look at is, as we're looking at the diffraction grating, we, instead of talking about the width of the openings, we talk about the distance between two adjacent openings. And so in this picture, the difference between two openings is showed to be D. And then we think about, like, if we're looking at some location on our screen a far distance away, and we're allowing the light as it's spreading out to be traveling in a direction of angle theta, the difference between two adjacent wavelengths or openings, the difference in the wavelength of, the difference in the path would equal d sine theta. And so this becomes our condition where we would want to look for constructive interference, because if that's equal to some integer multiple of a wavelength, then we're going to get constructive interference. What I mentioned in class is that if we're looking at this scenario, we actually are thinking about the fact that we can have d sine theta is equal to m lambda. You can get different angles of constructive interference for different wavelengths. And this is why the diffraction grating would actually allow us to break down white light into its component parts, because we would get constructive interference for the different wavelengths, which of course are the different colors of light, at different angles. And so that allows them to get separated. And so here we see the blue and the violet and the red at the opposite ends, because they're going to constructively interfere at a different angle, because it's going to be a different condition for constructive interference depending on what the wavelength is. Now, in terms of the order where M comes into play, you actually will typically get probably two different constructive interference patterns from a diffraction grating. As you can see, as we go from outward to the second order, you can see the intensity is getting a lot less, and that will happen, and it actually becomes much harder to see even the second order constructive interference pattern when you're looking at a diffraction grating. Also, keep in mind that in this situation, because we're seeing the wavelengths or the light being broken down into different wavelengths that are present in the light source, normally in our other situations we had a constructive interference at the central line, but if we allowed m equal to 0, that would actually say that essentially all the colors can interfere constructively at that location. But because all the colors have all different wavelengths, you're not going to see them separated into the rainbow pattern that we are looking for. And so you just see the white, central white spot, which is just the combination of all the colors. You only see the rainbow or the breaking down of the spectra when you look off center from the central point. So as I said at the beginning, the diffraction grating actually is usually grooves are engraved in the glass to make the diffraction grating, instead of actually making many, many, many slits very close together, because it would be extremely difficult to do that and to actually have a diffraction grating that was stable could actually be used without like just breaking apart. And so in a sense, this whole action, while we're sort of illustrating it as if the light's passing through these openings, they're actually reflecting off of these grooves. And not another place that we see that happening, but really not by design, is if you look at a DVD or a CD, because the information that's contained on those is through the grooves that are cut into the DVD or the CD. And what they do is they end up acting sort of as a diffraction grating, and you can actually see, as you sort of tilt them relative to the light, you can actually see the effect of that by seeing sort of rainbow and colored patterns appearing on the surface. We also see this sort of idea happening in nature, and here are just two pictures of, where you sort of see like a reflection grating. One is, the left hand picture is for an opal, which you might be familiar with, has sort of, kind of rainbowy type patterns to it, depending on how you look at it. And then also on the right hand side, we see these, the butterfly wings, which also can produce some very pretty effects. So looking at some of our examples in this problem here, we have the light is of our wavelength. Here we're actually just passing light of a particular wavelength and looking at where its maxima occur. And so we're seeing that the angle where the maximums are found is 17.8 degrees, and that would correspond to an m equals 1. And we know that our wavelength is 632.8 nanometers. So using our condition for constructive interference, this allows us to actually figure out d, which would be m lambda over the sine of theta, which would be 632.8 times 10 to the minus 9 over the sine of 17.8 degrees. Now this gives us actually the d is the distance between the lines, which I found was 2.07 times 10 to the minus 6, and that would be meters per line. So that's kind of saying, how many meters are associated with one line. If we want to know the line density, which is actually the lines per centimeter, first I could take the inverse of this, and I'd get 1 over d, and this would be equal to 4.83 times 10 to the 5th lines per meter. Now, it asks for lines per centimeter, so I would want to change the units of this. And this would end up to be 4.83 times 10 to the 3rd lines per centimeter, or I could just say it's 4,830 lines per centimeter. Now, if we look at the second part of the question, it asks for how many additional pairs will appear. Which is essentially the same as asking the question, what would be the highest m that we could get? And we've answered this type of question before in looking at other examples of small slit interference, like double slit. If we look at this d sine theta is equal to m lambda, we're going to let theta be equal to 90 degrees, because that's the largest sort of angle deflection that we could see an interference pattern from the central maximum. And then solve for m. So m could be equal to the d sine of 90 over wavelength And if we do that, I get a number of 3.28. M has to be an integer number, and so the highest M that we could actually expect would be M equals 3, which kind of goes along with what I had said previously, that we really don't actually usually get a lot of these patterns. We usually only really get like maybe 2 reliably. Here we can see that it's possible to get an additional 3, but it would be really hard to see this third pattern. All right, so let's look at another example. So if we have a diffraction grating with 10,000 lines per centimeter, we want to do a little bit of experimenting with that. So the 10,000 lines per centimeter is actually 1 over the distance between the lines. So we find that D for this scenario is 1 times 10 to the minus 4 centimeters, which would correspond to 1 times 10 to the minus 6 meters. So that's the distance between the grooves on this diffraction grating. We're going to take white light. The screen is 2 meters away. We usually use X to denote that distance. And we want to find the angles for the first order diffraction for the shortest and longest wavelengths. The idea here is we're looking at sort of the span of where the interference pattern is going to start. It's going to start with the shortest wavelength and then go to the longest wavelength. And that's why we're being asked to find those 2 angles. So if we do the violet and M equals 1, we're looking at D sine theta is equal to the wavelength 380 times 10 to the minus 9. If we look for that angle, we find the angle for the violet corresponds to 22.3 degrees. For the red, we're going to say the sine of theta. Now the wavelength for that is 760. And the angle that we would get for the red is actually 49.5 degrees. So you can see that there's a pretty big span, and the idea is that if we can spread out these wavelengths in a larger span, you can actually get to see more detail, and that's why it's actually preferred. Now here they want to know the difference in the Y values. So if we're looking at here's the diffraction grating, here's the screen, we're sort of saying here's the violet and here's the red, and we want to know the difference between these 2 Y values. Now remember, we said that the tangent of that angle, so here's the angle theta, is equal to Y over X. X is the distance to the screen. So the Y of the violet is equal to 2 meters times the tangent of 22.3 degrees. And that gives us a Y value of